Next, I want to turn to Jonathan Friedman from PEN America to share some of his thoughts, not only on this research, but on First Amendment issues generally in the age of COVID. Jonathan, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Mohammed, and thanks, Sam. I appreciate the survey findings, and I'm thankful for the opportunity to react to them on behalf of PEN America and help contextualize their significance in the broader moment we're in related to the pandemic. My first reaction to the survey and to the findings is that they confirm a vital theme that we at PEN America have been talking about for years, that a rising generation was at risk for being alienated from the First Amendment and the concept of free speech. I think that the data shows well the need not just for increased civic literacy right now, but a deeper appreciation of free speech as an inclusive value. In our view, you don't really have a campus that is open to free speech unless it's supportive of free speech for all, and you don't have an inclusive and equitable campus if it's not open to free speech whatsoever. The two are part and parcel, deeply implicated in one another. I think it's vital that when we think about campuses, we think about them as places where everyone is able to speak. First-generation students, people of color, LGBTQ students, students from rural upbringings, and liberals, progressive, conservatives, all the intersecting identities in between. I think they all need to feel welcome on a college campus, in college classrooms, and in the quad, that they have opportunities to voice their opinions, and that they have a common understanding of free speech as a core value to the academy. I think in recent years, we've seen a lot of threats to that. Increases in hateful expression, efforts to make campuses more inclusive that sometimes verge on censorship or stifle creativity and open exchange, knee-jerk reactions by administrators who discipline professors or students over things said in class or even sometimes online, and an increase in political polarization across the board. All of these things are challenges right now, and they were all challenges before the pandemic. Now, many on campuses were well aware of these challenges. You know, there's been a great deal of effort to shine a light on them, and I think there were many initiatives, important initiatives being undertaken. But I think it's clear that, you know, there was more to be done, and campuses, to make campuses really open to free speech for all was, you know, clearly very much still a challenge as represented in these findings. Unfortunately, the kinds of efforts that I think we need on campuses are also likely to be the ones that are kind of at risk of being casualties of the pandemic right now. The reality is that campuses have gone online, but threats to free speech haven't gone anywhere. I think it's too early to say whether the pandemic on its own has put free speech at greater risk, but it's clear that the dynamics that are illustrated in the survey are prone to worsening because of it. So on the one hand, I think that disbanding the physical gatherings of campus has the potential to have a narrowing effect on the diversity of ideas that students come into contact with. It's hard to replicate the quad, the hallways, the conversations around classrooms with a professor before or after class, in student clubs and organizations, at events, at social gatherings, all those opportunities where somebody can say something to you that, you know, challenges you or even just kind of opens your mind a little bit more to something different. So without that, if the primary or frankly sole mode of engagement for college students right now is online, then we have to consider barriers to entry, like whether students have the equipment and Wi-Fi at home, whether they have supportive home environments, and whether frankly they're able to spend a great deal of time online or not. We also have to consider the climate that they encounter online. As you mentioned, many students have reported in this survey finding that online discourse stifles free speech, and that in other moments, online interactions on social media are not really the most conducive to deep civil engagement. If anything, it's, you know, often the opposite. I think there are also huge challenges with online harassment. Even in the shift online, the big story in the past 2 months has been just the incredible rise of online harassment, abuse, hate, and most common Zoom bombing, which we know anecdotally at least has targeted disproportionately people of color, Asian American, and Pacific Islander communities in their meetings online. And all of that is making for a climate online where, you know, not just people are likely to be harassed, but we have to think about the potential effects of that on how people continue to think about and have an attitude towards engaging online. So all of these things, you know, it's not one-off. It can kind of build up in people's minds. And then there, at the same time, are just general challenges with remote learning, which there is, you know, a great deal of research on how students learn online, how we can structure courses for students to learn. Of course, everything was kind of rushed online as higher education as professors were kind of asked to perform CPR for their courses and for universities across the country. But now we have a ton of questions to face about how best to encourage diverse participation in line, dynamic exchange, openness, and trust among students. These are challenges right now that I think that are being faced by students and faculty alike. So on the other hand, there are a set of challenges to free speech we're seeing that are new, that are here in higher ed because of the pandemic. Challenges to academic freedom for scientists and medical experts, concerns that cost-cutting measures are not only going to target contingent faculty, but also that those faculty are going to be afraid of speaking out because of the specter of losing their jobs. And then there's also challenges we've seen reported with student press, many of which are continuing to operate but face significant challenges with finances because of losses in ad revenue, challenges with communications with campus administrators, and then there are the physical risks of investigating, reporting on, and photographing during the pandemic in their communities. I think we also have to remember that in a lot of communities, with the death of local news, college newspapers kind of filled that void, and now there's a heavy burden on young people's shoulders. So I think that these observations in higher ed also dovetail with what we're seeing across the country. I don't think that, today in May we are on the verge or on the brink of authoritarianism, but like in higher ed, I think there is that the pandemic has taken a set of threats to free speech and heightened them, and then it has simultaneously presented new challenges. For example, even before COVID-19, there were significant threats to journalists, efforts by government officials to stifle hard questions or critical reporting. There were concerns about the decimation of local news and communities, as I mentioned, and the rise of disinformation on social media. These are all concerns heading up to the election, and they haven't gone away. At Penn, we've also been tracking for the last number of years threats to professors, journalists, and others in online harassment. And I'll say that in terms of our internal tracking, in the past month, clicks and access to our online harassment field manual that Penn runs have shot up just tremendously. So it's clear, at least from our view, that that's an issue. The pandemic has presented also in some ways what we might think of as the perfect storm for all of these trends to worsen. Around the world, authoritarian governments we've seen were quick to use the pandemic to stifle opposition or strengthen their power. And the infodemic presents new opportunities for those who seek to disinform, threats for citizens and communities that may not have the knowledge and understanding of how information can be and is being manipulated. So there's a real threat right now, I think, that people check out of the political process. Already we've seen how the election has kind of faded in the public imagination, just because, frankly, even if you're trying to focus on it, the pandemic is so disruptive, so overwhelming, and so wide-ranging. So the point here is that while official action in the name of public health, right now they do seem necessary and well-intentioned, we just always have to weigh those actions, especially if they're going to involve surveillance, threats to free press, or threats to access to information, because those are our core civil liberties. And we have to be vigilant and continue to press that any program that involves contact tracing, for example, or that such programs consider what safeguards need to be in place to protect privacy. We have to evaluate also the actions of the Trump administration continually, not just in light of what they're doing today, but in light of their record. And that's a record that at times has threatened the free speech rights of citizens that it doesn't agree with, or sought to undermine trust in reporters and our civic institutions. So I'll leave you with one thought, which is I think that the longer that this goes on, the more sophisticated and diverse the threats to our democracy are going to be. And I think this is something that both higher education and the wider public have to be attuned to, especially as colleges and universities are facing the real prospect that they may not be reopening physically in the fall. I think there is a huge burden, an onus on them to think hard about these issues and how they're going to be upholding the Academy's commitments to free speech and civic engagement, even if they are stuck operating in the virtual realm.